All right, so today we're going to talk about low carb, why you may want to try it, and how to do it. Before we get into that, I just want to cover some key points of what it is that I want us to know. First of all, carbohydrates are the biggest problem for most people, and that includes the people of the SHT community, which is why we have our rules around carbohydrates. Carbohydrates have the biggest impact in a negative direction of all the macronutrients on body composition and health markers. Eating real food the SHT way is lower carbish than the standard American diet for sure, but it's also low carb in and of itself, and we'll talk more about that today. Carbohydrates in the context of our way of eating are not a problem. I think the difficulty for most people is just following the rules. And then low carb, we don't believe is healthy or necessary over the long term, but it can be useful as an experiment and as a temporary tool. So let's do a quick review of what we're doing with real food. All right, remember we have two main focuses. The first focus is we're eating for nutrients. Nutrients are what build this body. They contribute to structure and form and all the different functions in the body. And then we're also eating in a way that nurtures self-sufficiency, which is the body's own self-reliance, the body's ability to make its own energy and be metabolically flexible and ideally fat burning over time. So when we're eating for nutrients, we're eating foods that are nutrient dense, and this especially includes the animal meats and traditional fats and nutrient dense vegetables, and then full fat dairy products if you tolerate them. But then we're eating in a way that trains the body how to use its own fat for fuel. And this automatically happens when we eat real food our way and we're strategic with our carbohydrates, meaning that we time our carbohydrates later in the day from real food sources in moderated amounts. And then again, just think about what it is we're trying to do big picture. What are we trying to do with food? We're trying to eat real food. We're trying to be strategic with our carbohydrates, and then we're trying to allow space and periods of not eating. In a lot of our talks and progressions, we talk about the keys to self-sufficiency. So if we just mentioned one of our two focuses with real food is self-sufficiency, we have all these different things and tools that we can use to nudge the body in this direction of self-sufficiency. So one of them is strategic carbohydrate consumption, which we just mentioned. And then also having space in between meals, allowing natural space with no snacking. And then we definitely want to experiment with periodic low carb our way, and then also training on an empty stomach, and then strategic fasting protocols. But today we're going to talk about low carb because it is one of our keys to self-sufficiency. Now, one of the problems most of us have is that we are overcoming and undoing years, if not decades, of insulin resistance. And if you're not familiar with insulin resistance is when the cells of the body don't respond properly to the hormone insulin because of oversecretion for a lifetime. Insulin resistance is the driving factor that leads to type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome. So let's talk just a little bit more about insulin resistance. So we believe that insulin resistance is what's behind metabolic syndrome, which is basically a cluster of symptoms, including being overweight, having high blood sugar and type 2 diabetes, having high blood pressure, having inflammatory markers, and then having poor lipid numbers. If you have 3 or more of these symptoms, then you would be considered having metabolic syndrome. Now, if insulin resistance is behind metabolic syndrome, then what contributes to insulin resistance? Well, first of all, eating inappropriate foods and especially refined carbohydrates, eating too many times a day, and then over time, this adds up and builds cumulative damage. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, all right? So what actually happens when you eat as far as insulin goes? So when you eat food, especially carbohydrates and proteins, these macronutrients and macro foods stimulate insulin. Right? Insulin is secreted because insulin does two things. It makes energy and nutrients immediately usable, and then it also stores energy. So proteins are broken down into amino acids. Those amino acids are used or recombined into proteins again and used in different ways. And then also maybe they're stored, and then carbohydrates are either used or turned into glycogen and stored in muscles and liver, or turned into excess body fat. Now, what's interesting about insulin secretion is that insulin is secreted in different amounts for different macronutrients. So fat is going to have the smallest secretion of insulin, protein a little bit higher, and then carbohydrates the highest of all the different macronutrients. So when insulin is secreted, we just have to understand that this is directing the body to store energy and specifically to store fat. So every time I eat food, I'm going to secrete some insulin, and depending on what that type of food is, I'm going to secrete more insulin, especially if it's carbohydrate based, and that means I have more of a potential for fat storage. And the only thing that is going to take away from that is going to be space in between meals. So remember that old way of thinking that I think most of us came from, which is the calories in, calories out model. Basically says that if I expend more calories in a day than I take in, I'm going to lose weight. And if I expend less calories in a day than I take in, I'm going to gain weight. This thinking is completely flawed because it assumes that I can control one of those two variables and the other one doesn't change. I can control either eating less and then I'm going to continue to expend the same amount of calories, or I can consume the same amount of calories and just exercise more and then I'm going to lose weight. So the reason this doesn't work is, first of all, it does not account for the type and source or quality of those calories. So there's a big difference between me eating meats and traditional fats and nutrient-dense vegetables, 2,000 calories of that versus 2,000 calories of refined carbohydrates. And it doesn't account for the fact that exercising does not impact total calories burned in a day. There's a minimal impact, but when I exercise, I am burning some calories, but then my body has to compensate by pulling back on some of its other resources. Reducing calories does not work. Calories in is not independent of calories out. The less calories I consume over time, the more my body reduces its expenditure over time because it has to. All right, so let's look back at that insulin resistance model now, knowing what we know about the impact of macronutrients on insulin secretion. With carbohydrates having that maximum secretion, insulin resistance comes from the type of foods that we're eating. And for most people, that means a lot of carbohydrates and a lot of refined carbohydrates, which means a really big secretion of insulin, which takes more time to dissipate from the bloodstream. The longer the insulin is in the bloodstream, the more that I'm contributing to fat storage. All right. Then you add to that what most people think is healthy, which is eating 5, 6, 7, 8 times a day. You have your main meals and you have snacks in between meals. The problem with that is that we're secreting insulin in higher frequencies and in higher amounts because of the type of foods that we're eating. And then you add that up over time, and this damage, it might be subtle, but it's cumulative. So it does take time for this thing to happen. And I think a really good way to look at this, a really good analogy, is an analogy that we pulled from Dr. Fong and his Complete Guide to Fasting and the Obesity Code, which is basically you have a refrigerator. That refrigerator represents glycogen stores in your liver. All right, so the glycogen stores is your storage form of glucose. And so in between meals, you can go into your liver glycogen and use that for energy. That's the way things are supposed to work, and that's the way they usually work, right? So just like with a refrigerator, my food is meant to go in and come out really easy. And then you can think of our fat stores as it being in these deep freezers. It's a little bit more difficult to access. I have to pull it out and let it thaw. All right, so every time I eat food, I'm putting some energy into my liver glycogen. I'm also putting a little bit of energy into my stored body fats. And then what's ideal is that my body understands how to tap into those deep freezers. Now that only happens from eating minimal carbohydrates or being strategic with your carbohydrates, and then also having space in between meals and fasting protocols, because that's when the body can actually dissipate a lot of that insulin that's in the bloodstream, and I can allow myself to tap into the fat stores that are in my deep freezers. That doesn't mean that I have to completely run out of food or liver glycogen. It means I have to train my body how to get used to doing that. And again, insulin is the biggest driver. So if I am reducing my carbohydrates and or being strategic with my carbohydrates, and if I have less frequency of meals, the likelihood of me tapping into my fat stores is bigger because I'm having less insulin secretion and less frequency of insulin secretion. So if we look at US sugar consumption back in the 1900s, you're looking at maybe 50 or 60 pounds per capita, which means per man, woman, and child per year. All right, and then you fast forward to the 2000s, and we're looking at over 120 pounds of sugar per person per year. This is a huge part of what explains the chronic obesity rates and diabetes rates and metabolic syndrome rates, right? Then also add to that the fact that Back in the 1970s, the average number of meals per day was about 2 or 3 meals per day. Fast forward that to the 2000s, and you're looking at the average number of meals per day being around 5 or 6 meals per day, and a lot of people in excess of that, right? People just feel like they got to graze all day, every day. All right, so let's look at some examples of what someone might be consuming as far as carbohydrates go if they're following the conventional wisdom view of what we need to do to be healthy. All right, so according to the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans, carbohydrates should make up 45 to 65% of a person's total daily caloric intake, which means that if someone's consuming 2,000 calories in a day, this is about 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates per day, which sounds insane, and it is, because I think it's almost impossible to reach unless you're really trying to eat a lot of carbohydrates. But let's look at maybe like a normal breakfast, all right? So net carbs, by the way, is total carbohydrates minus fiber, which gives us sugar and starch. So if I consume a glass of orange juice, which a lot of people think is healthy, we're looking at 25 grams of net carbs, which is mostly sugar. And if I consume a bowl of oatmeal with that, which a lot of people start their day off with a bowl of oatmeal, that's 30 grams of net carbs. And then let's throw in a banana, that's 25 grams of net carbs for a total of 80 grams of net carbs just in breakfast alone. And then let's move to lunch. A lot of people like to have slightly lighter lunch. Green smoothies are super popular right now, and green juices. So depending on how much fruit's in that, we're looking at 25 to 60 grams of net carbs. And then let's throw in a bowl of quinoa, which everybody thinks is healthy. That's another 34 grams of net carbs for a total of about 60 grams of net carbs. And then going to dinner, for most people, that's the biggest meal of the day. Let's have a bowl of brown rice, 3/4 of a cup of brown rice, 48 grams of net carbs. 3/4 of a decent sized sweet potato, we're looking at about 26 grams of net carbs. Throw in some Strauss ice cream for dessert, 3/4 of a cup of Strauss ice cream, that's 22 grams of net carbs. And then a small bowl of fruit, 18 grams, we're looking at a total of 100 grams of net carbs. All right, and then of course throughout the day, most people are going to throw in something like a cookie or a pastry or maybe a mocha frappuccino at 33 grams of net carbs. So we're looking at 200 plus grams of net carbs, and this is why a lot of our population is suffering from insulin resistance. Now let's look at how low carb the SHT is. So if we had a sliding scale about the amount of net carbs and body composition changes that we could expect, if we were under 50 grams of net carbs, that's what we would consider either fasting and or being in ketosis. If we were between 50 grams of net carbs and 100 grams of net carbs, I think that's the spot, the sweet spot for most people that's going to be effortless weight loss over time. If I creep up to 100 grams of net carbs, up to 150 grams of net carbs, that's going to be something that's more maintenance based. And then anything over 150 grams of net carbs in a day is definitely going to be some fat gain. All right. So we measured out, some of our safe starches and some of our sweet stuff just to see how many net carbs were in it. A half a cup of white rice and sweet potato and white potato all equate to less than 25 grams of net carbs. If I have a bowl of frozen fruit, about a half a cup of frozen berries, we're looking at 7 grams of net carbs. A half a cup of some Honeycrisp apple, you're looking at about 15 grams of net carbs. So even eating the things that we would consider dominant sources of carbohydrates, dominant sources of starch and sugar, if we measure those things out the way that we recommend, it's still relatively lower carbish. But let me show you an evening for myself and how many net carbs are in that. So most evenings, unless I'm going through like a low carb phase or some other experiment, I have about 3/4 of a cup of sweet potato, which is about 34 grams of net carbs. I have about 3/4 of a cup of fresh or frozen berries, which is about 10 grams of net carbs. And then I usually like to have a quarter to a half a bar of dark chocolate, some low sugar dark chocolate, which is about 16 grams of net carbs. Total all that together, and that's still only 60 grams of net carbs in a typical evening for me. All right, so I think what I'm trying to say here is that when you eat real food and when you're strategic with your carbohydrates the way that we recommend, you're still low carb according to most methodologies out there. All right, so what is low carb to us? What is low carb to the SHT? If we just said that we're already low carb compared to the standard American diet, and even within the real food realm, we are lower carb-ish, what if we actually want to go low carb? Low carb to us would mean pulling out all the dominant carbohydrates or dominant sources of starch and sugar, which means no safe starches, no fruits, no honey, no dark chocolate, no sweet things, and no alcohol. We want this to be very intuitive, so we're not going to weigh and measure anything, right? So we're just pulling out those dominant carbohydrates, and that means that we can eat as much animal meats, traditional fats, and nutrient-dense vegetables as we want, because those foods tend to be auto-satiating and auto-appetite regulating because they're so nutrient-dense. And then we just want to bounce in and out of low carb as much as we feel comfortable, all right? So if I'm looking at maybe this week, I'm going to try as many attempts at low carb as I can. I'm going to get up my first day, and my goal is to make it to bed without having dominant carbohydrates. Right? And if I make it to bed, then I've had one successful day of low carb, and then I want to try to do that again the next day. And within 2 or 3 days, I think most of us should notice something. We should notice if this feels like it's something that works for us or not. All right, so after 2 or 3 days, maybe I feel like I got a break and I need to fall back and have a little bit of fruit or a little bit of dark chocolate with some honey. That's perfectly fine. Then I want to get up again the next day, and maybe I make it 3 or 4 days. Maybe I make it 4 or 5 days my next stint, right? So some of this is going to be an experimental process. Some of it's going to be going through an adaptation process where we feel kind of off, and then we're trying to push ourselves a little bit more. And it's all good because we want to have fun with it. And if pulling out all sources of carbohydrates seems like it's too difficult in the beginning, maybe your first attempt is something that's lower carb than what you're doing right now. So I mentioned before, a typical evening when I'm having my carbohydrates, 3/4 of a cup of sweet potato, 3/4 of a cup of fresh or frozen fruit, and then half a bar of dark chocolate with some honey. Maybe for me, I'm pulling out my sweet potato and my fruit, but I'm still having a little bit of dark chocolate and honey. That's lower carb than what I was doing before, and I should notice some kind of change from that, right? So maybe I do that for a little bit before getting into something that looks low carb, our version, okay? So, and just keep in mind, we're trying to be easy and have some fun with this and not make this too neurotic or too stressful. All right, we want to bounce in and out of things as we feel comfortable, but we definitely want to experiment. So remember why we want to experiment with low carb. Well, we already went through this whole discussion around insulin resistance. So we want to shock the body into self-sufficiency, self-reliance, metabolic flexibility, and fat burning, because we're undoing years, if not decades, of being freaking carbivores and insulin resistance. And so this is one of the ways that we can undo that damage. We also want to prove to ourselves that we can do this. We want to prove to ourselves that we can go through periods of time without having dominant sources of carbohydrates, because that will equate to freedom over time. The more that I can go without things that I feel like I can't go without, the more freedom I'm going to experience, because the more that I understand, in this specific situation, carbohydrates don't rule my life anymore. I know that I can go through periods of not having them. And then we also definitely want to see what works for us. We got to experiment. So maybe for some of us, going through some low carb days is going to be the best thing that ever happened to us. We're going to notice some weight loss. We're going to feel really good. For some of us, it's going to be a miserable experience, and it's all good. We want that feedback, all right? So we have some tips on how to go low carb. This will be like some bonus download information. Most of this we should be doing already if we're eating real food and we're taking the supplements that we recommend for healing and recovery and anti-inflammation. But just as a bonus, we'll have that available as a download. All right, so let's review what it is that we need to know from this information, aside from understanding how to do low carb our way. All right, first of all, carbohydrates are the biggest problem for most people, including the people of the SHT, which is why we have our rules around carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are going to have the biggest impact in a negative direction of all the different macronutrients we can consume on body composition and on health markers. Eating real food the SHT way is going to be lower carbish, definitely lower carbish than the standard American diet, and even within the real food realm, we're low carb. But it's still useful to go through periods of low carb just to see what works for us and to see how it feels. All right? Carbohydrates in the context of our way of eating is not a problem, so I don't want this discussion to make us carb phobic, but it does mean that we want to follow the rules when we are eating carbohydrates, and then we also want to go through periods of trying to do low carb our way. All right, and then low carb, we believe, is not healthy or necessary over the long term, but it can be useful as a temporary experiment and as a temporary tool. Now, if you'd like to enhance your learning, a couple of really good books are Dr. Fung's Complete Guide to Fasting and also Dr. Fung's Obesity Code. I've read both of them several times and they're freaking awesome. And it will confirm a lot of information that we talked about today. All right. So again, that was our version of low carb, why you may want to try it, and how to do it. Good luck. Let us know if you have any questions. We are here to support you.